Hi, it's Hertzog. I'd like to welcome you back to the Social Club, my analog digital hybrid studio. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the words we use to describe audio. When we're listening back, we choose all kinds of words, like muddy, or bright, or sizzly, or boomy, or boxy, and so on. But the point I'm trying to make is, what you call boomy might not be the same frequency range that I call boomy, and what you call bright might not be the same frequency range I call bright. So how do we get on the same page? How do we know that we're all using the same descriptors? Well, I've created a couple charts that kind of think of audio broken out in different terms. One chart I have has everything broken out into lows, low mids, mids, high mids, highs. The other one is broken into adjective words like boxy or boomy, and that's got many more breaks in it because we're talking about specific frequency ranges. And those frequency ranges are important. If I'm working with an artist and the artist says to me, this mix sounds too bright, what should I do? Where should I start adjusting? 3K, 4K, 5K, 6K? What's considered bright? We're going to get to the bottom of it, or at least my descriptor of it. And then hopefully we can all get on the same page and talk about audio in the same way. So when we're listening back to a shared piece of music, we can be using the same types of words to describe it. So has that ever happened to you where you're sitting there talking about a mix with an engineer and you start using words and they're using different words and you don't even know if you're speaking the same language? It can happen. Miscommunication about the audio can lead to confusion. So today we're going to take a deep dive into common audio descriptors. We're going to talk about what they mean, where they occur on the frequency spectrum, and how we can all get on the same page about using the same words to describe what we're hearing. Before we jump into the specific terms, let's go over the audio spectrum that we're capable of hearing. It starts at 20 hertz and it goes all the way up to 20 kilohertz. Your 20 hertz is mostly rumble. Your 20 kilohertz is mostly high-pitched sizzle that the majority of you won't even be able to hear because as we age, we lose the higher frequencies off our frequency range that we can perceive. And that's where I can really lean on my metering to know when something's peaking way up at 20K, why is it doing that? What is that bringing to the sound? And how can I make it not painful for people of all ages to listen to it? If we're going to jump into the terms, let's start with muddy. What does muddy mean to you? To me, as an engineer, if I'm listening back and I hear a client describe, it sounds a bit muddy to me, that's going to be 200 hertz to 400 hertz. Now, occasionally it can go slightly lower, slightly higher, but 200 to 400 is really the range that we are going to describe as muddy if it has a little too much energy there. And that's because the frequency range can often cause instruments and vocals to blend together and kind of mask each other. And you're going to describe that as muddy because they don't sound distinct. They sound like they're overlapping and it's just covering each other up. Imagine looking through muddy water. Everything's kind of hazy and unclear. That's the same kind of thing in audio. Too much buildup in that muddy area can make vocals sound unclear and can make your guitars sound kind of indistinct. They just sound too heavy. Typically, the way I address muddiness is I cut some of the frequencies there on the individual tracks, and I try to carve out so that each frequency has its own space in the frequency spectrum without overlapping and stepping on another one. All right, so let's talk about boxy. What's boxy to you? To me, boxy runs from about 250 to 500. The reason people call it boxy is because it sounds like if someone was performing inside a cardboard box. It has this paper pulpiness to it that boom bap hip hop. Boom bap hip hop is a perfect example of where boxy is the desire. That boom bap hip hop has that 200 to 500 range smacking typically. And that's where you get that boomy, boxy kind of sound from. And that happens when you start adding all the different tracks together and you get a build up at a certain frequency range. The vocal itself might not sound boxy. The guitar itself might not sound boxy. But when you overlap them, suddenly they're summing at that frequency range, which boosts it too high and changes the overall sound of the record. All right, now let's talk about one of the most common ones I hear, bright. People always talk about, oh, it sounds very bright and energetic. Brightness typically lives around 5 kilohertz. It can start as low as 3, it can go up to 6 or 7, but then you start getting into your highs. So when we're really talking about bright, which is going to be the sibilance in vocals, the tss that you hear in vocals, that range, your guitars might poke through too much in that 4 to 5K range, sounding very bright, not enough body to them underneath, the opposite of muddy. And the issue that you can run into here is if you have too much information in that bright 5K region, it's going to shred your ears and it's not going to be a good listening experience. You're going to have listener's fatigue. Your ears are going to get overwhelmed by too much of that frequency and it's going to break down your listening experience and you're not going to enjoy it. Brightness is a balance that you have to toe. You have to toe that line because bright audio can sound better because it adds detail and clarity, but too much of it and you're losing the effect that you're going for. You want that clean, distinguishable sound, but you don't want it to come at the expense of everything else in the song. You don't want that frequency poking out too far because it's not going to make for a good listening experience. In my previous video where I talked about listening to different songs for the Lucid kit, the Seos Lucid kit that I had done. If you haven't seen that video, link. But in that video, I talked about the song Doin' Time by Sublime and how I didn't like the master on it because it's so bright. It has so much information up 3, 4, 5K that it distracts from the other songs in the album because the other songs in the album don't sound like that. So what's the difference between bright and harsh? Well, harsh is when bright has gone too far. Harsh is where those bright frequencies have been cranked too loud and you're hearing them and you got to adjust it and turn it down because you don't want that. You don't want harsh. You want bright. You don't want harsh. And you'll notice that shift from clarity to discomfort. I had an issue with this back when I was working on my first VHXRR EP with Rob. Rob and I were working on it together and I was too close to the material. I was listening to it with my production hat on and not with my engineer's hat on. And I was running into trouble. And we hired Count. I don't know if you know who Count is.
On the last 2 Tycho albums, we mixed everything totally in the box. And on this album, we really wanted to take things that next level. We really wanted to make like a no compromise kind of album.
Engineering for Tycho. If you like Tycho, you know how complex his music is and how well mixed and mastered it is. You can thank Count for that. Count's amazing. What I loved about this was he was telling me what was wrong with my own mixes. And he told me if it was too bright, if it was too harsh, if it was too muddy. He told me how my bass all sounded one note. There was no definition to it. And he was right. But by pointing specifics out to me, he helped me tremendously with my own engineering journey. And that was 10 years ago. So now I've taken that for the last 10 years and I've applied it in practice and I've gotten a lot better. But I couldn't have done it without his mentorship. So thank you, Count. All right. The next term up is warm. What does warm audio mean to you? To me, it's the company that makes my bus compressor that I put in the B bus of the Sigma. But here, we're using warm as a descriptor. Warm is considered full-bodied, rich, nice, smooth low end. Not necessarily bright or sparkly on the top, but a nice, warm, natural-sounding recording. And now warm goes from about 150 to 400. Now, do you see how we've already talked about 3 descriptors that kind of have overlapping areas, but each of them extends a little bit further in either direction? That's why this can get so confusing. And that's why we're trying to dial down to it. So to describe warm, warm can make a track sound nice and inviting. Like think singer-songwriter more than EDM, right? EDM, you're going to get bright, harsh, loud. Singer-songwriter, you're going to get a lot more natural, James Taylor-ish kind of, smooth, Don McLean, nicely recorded, warm audio. Nothing too bright or synthetic because it's not there in the original recording. And now let's get to another one. Airy. What is airy? What is it to you? To me, airy comes above 10K. And airiness is what gives your recordings that big, open feel. If you don't have enough high frequency information up there, you could sound a little muddy or a little boxed in. The space and the generation of those very high frequency effects are typically above 10K. And that's going to be what we describe as airy or open. You need that frequency information up there to be nice and detailed and smooth. So you might need some transient shaping while you're working on it. And you might need some roll off, to keep your highs clean and clear, but not overpowering and fatiguing. All right, as you can see, I generated this very nice graph for us to follow along and discuss about the ranges we talked about today. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the basic descriptors of lows, low mids, mids, high mids, and the highs. And the way I have that broken out is your lows are going to be everything from 20 hertz up to 200 hertz. That's usually where you hand off to a subwoofer, usually around there, 150, 200 hertz. Those are going to be your lows. That makes your low mids from about 200 to 500. It puts your mids from 500 to 2000, your high mids from 2000 to 6000, and your highs for this descriptor is going to be everything above 6K. When we look at the adjective descriptors that we have down here, when I say sub-bass, I'm talking about bass from 20 hertz up to 80 hertz. Now, boomy is going to have a little bit of overlap there. That's from about 45 to 100. That whole range can be very boomy in your car, your home theater, anywhere that you can get some cabin gain or room gain. It can sound boomy in that region. Bass is such a broad term. One of the lowest bass notes you can hit is like 31 hertz. So I put bass from like 30 hertz up to 600. Now 600 is a bit high, but if you have a bass guitar, you're going to notice that some of the notes you can play on a bass guitar can be up around that higher range. So I consider it to be up to 600. As we had talked about, warm, 150 hertz to 400. Little bit of overlap there with muddy, but muddy and warm are different descriptors. Muddy's a negative one, warm is a positive one. So even though they take over the same range, one's a good thing, one's a bad thing. Boxy might be good, might be bad, depending on what you're going for. If you're making some boom bap hip hop, you're going to want that boxy sound. If you're making a rock record, you don't want that boxy sound. 500 to 800 hertz is that honky nasal region. And I consider 800 to 1000 to be the vocal focus. Now, I don't mean that that's where it's easiest to focus on a vocal. I just mean that's typically male or female voices. They're going to be coming across in that 800 to 1000 range. Male vocals might, tend to be a bit lower to 400, but that 800 to 1000 range, everyone's voice is going to cover that. And so from 1000 to 4000, you start to get into presence. Now that's where you can really EQ that up and hear the crispness of someone's vocals. That comes from that 1K to 4K range. And 4K to 6K, you can start going harsh because remember, bright is 3K to 7K. And harsh is when you push that 4 to 6K range too hard in the brightness, and that brightness becomes harshness. So you got to pull that back a little bit. And then I have highs from 7,000 to 10,000, and everything above 10K is air and sparkle. I find this to be useful, these descriptors. I can keep modifying this chart. If you guys have some suggestions, I can do a follow-up video where we add things or rearrange things. Tell me what you think these ranges should be, because we're using different terms here, terms that I know everyone else is using when they're describing audio. But if we don't all have the same definition, we can be confusing each other. So I hope this helps. All right, so how can we ensure that we're all on the same page here when we're describing audio? Well, let's recap the terms. Remember, we're always trying to pair descriptive terms with specific frequencies, okay? Getting the feedback, it sounds a little too boxy, isn't as helpful as someone saying, I think there's too much 300 hertz information there. And so if you are finding that you can't find the words to describe what you're hearing, right? Maybe send a reference track. Maybe send the reference track over and let the engineer listen and go, okay, they want something brighter, or they want something darker, or whatever the case may be. So let's recap quickly. Muddy is going to be 200 hertz to about 400 hertz, right? Boxy is about 250 to 500. Warm is 150 to 400. So while they're overlapping, they have their slight differences. And remember, muddy is going to sound unclear and indistinct. Boxy is going to sound honky and congested. Bright is going to be crisp and detailed, but it can become harsh if you don't watch it. Warm is from 150 to 400, and it might sound warm and rich, but it can become muddy if you go too far with it. The same way bright can become harsh, warm can become muddy. And airy is above 10K. You might put it above 8K. I'm putting it above 10K. So now that we've discussed some of these terms, do you feel like you have a better idea? If so, drop a comment down here and let me know what you use to describe your terms. And if this video even made sense to you, I hope it did. And if it did, maybe you can pass it on to your friends and I can get some more subscribers. Speaking of, like and subscribe, please. Like and subscribe. So clear communication in your audio descriptors can help engineers, musicians, and just hi-fi folks who love sitting back and enjoying the music. It can help us all communicate easier and get to the crux of what we're talking about quicker. And are there any descriptors you'd like to hear more about? Do you want me to elaborate more on any of the descriptors I've given you? Drop me a line. I can make a future video about it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications for future videos. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to keep your mixes clear, balanced, and sounding great. And if you can't manage that on your own, send it to me and I'll do it. That's what I do for a living. So thank you for coming along. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Ralph slept the entire time on the couch. My descriptor for Ralph is sleepy. And it's accurate. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them below. Thank you for coming along for the ride. And until next time, this has been Von Hertzog from the Social Club.